Hello and welcome to Equipped, episode 5. I'm Aaron Garner.
I'm Harry Lansley.
And today we're going to talk about something a little bit different because, Harry, you came in today with a bit of a bee in your bonnet about something. What was it?
The lift wasn't working and I had to take the stairs. But beyond that, what has been driving me crazy is we've all seen all the articles and videos about Joe Biden, and there's a lot of body language people talking about his body language and stuff. And I mean, that's all well and good. It's not really our bag. We're not going to get into that world. But what was driving me mental was everyone talking about baseline. Mm-hmm. And they talk about baseline as if it's this magical item that once you have, it's really easy to find out whether someone's being deceptive or how someone's thinking and feeling. And I know you've got a lot to say on baseline. So at this point, I'm going to pitch it over to you and just kind of let people know about your perspective on baseline and why you feel so many people put such value on this word baseline.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. From a baseline as a word, people talk about it a lot, as you say, and it's how people normally behave is typically, I think, what people use the word to mean. But it's far more than that. And in our models of communication and analysing behaviour, we're always looking at the channels of communication and think about how do these match what they're saying, the account, how do they match the context, and how does it match the baseline? And we do have that word, and we talk about baseline in all of our trainings, but baseline doesn't exist. There is no such thing as a baseline. So anytime we hear someone say, I watched a video of this particular individual, whether it's a criminal or a politician or whatever it might be, and said, oh, that's not their baseline, singular.
Yeah.
That's a silly point to make because everybody has multiple baselines, even within the same context. So
I want to dig into that a little bit deeper with you. But just before we do, you talked about communication channels. Now, for those people who are new to what we do here, can you just explain what the communication channels are and how they relate to body language? And then we'll start diving into baseline.
I think so, yeah. So when we talk about body language, for example, it seems to be an umbrella term for everything that isn't the words that people are using and those elements. We look at 6 different channels. So the SCAN system, the 6-channel analysis system. So we're looking at the face. So that's this area here. Now, the face is used for so many different reasons. We communicate emotion. We communicate elements of what we're thinking potentially as well. So we show that cognitive elements. We use it to communicate generally, a bit like I just did with my brows. So I use my brows a lot to mark. So the face is used for lots of different things. And there's a lot of information out there on the face. And if you learn about micro expressions, for example, there are emotions that flash at a very small amount of time on the face to indicate someone's feeling an emotion that may be being suppressed. And if you know that, you can detect lies and all that kind of stuff. It's interesting and it's useful, but it's not the only thing we have to pay attention to. And it is not the magic bullet to catch lies or understand people. So there's so much that can happen with the face. But we've got the face, we've got body language. Again, we've talked about body language in previous episodes and how we use whether we should use body language in a particular way. So we've got the face, we've got the body, and then we've got psychophysiology, which is all of those things that happen under the hood, essentially. And that's, if you were to wire someone up with a polygraph, we're talking about the output of a polygraph machine that detects psychophysiological responses, things like sweating and heart rate, respiration. And those are things that are harder to see with the naked eye or hear. But we can see elements of that. We can see the way that people change in their behaviour when we have an increase in heart rate or respiration or the digestive system changes. So that's psychophysiology. So we've got the face, body, we've got psychophysiology. And then we have voice, interactional style, and verbal content. So that's voice is the way that we sound, so the acoustic qualities of our voices. So that's pitch, volume, tone, for example. The way my voice sounds very different to your voice.
Yep.
And then interactional style, how people use the words that they use. And then the actual verbal content is the actual words they choose to use, so the actual narrative. So with the combination of those, audible, voice, interactional style elements, and the words combined with face, body, and psychophysiology. They give us our 6 channels.
Right. So if we take those 6 channels as a whole, and then we think about how people then talk about baseline. So when they're talking about baseline, they're talking about the usual behavior of someone within the realm of those 6 channels normally.
Yeah.
What is it they're looking for? What exactly, when they say, I've dialed in his baseline, what do they actually mean?
So baselining is something that's very, very important in any kind of analytical work. But it's important if you want to understand people generally, because we're looking for deviations of how people are behaving in a particular context. So when you say what they're looking for, it's that in this context, in this very specific, this situation, for example, how does Harry behave right now in this context? And you're sitting a particular way, you're sounding a particular way, and that's your baseline right now in this moment. And I'm talking second to second to second. That would be considered your baseline. And if we are moving around in some of the questions and the conversations, and I change the topic, or I change the style of what I'm saying, or I do something very different, that's going to change the context of this, and that's going to change your base. So while I'm talking to you like this, that's your baseline. But if I then start talking to the camera, I'm not talking to you anymore. Therefore, you might shift because the context of the interaction has shifted. So whenever we change the context, we change the baseline, which is why when we're working in corporate context, for example, and in recruitment, and people say, I take them for a coffee in the coffee room before an interview, get to know them a little bit.
Get more relaxed and
get them relaxed, and then we go into the interview room and do the interview. Well, that's not the same baseline. You've got a baseline for small talk, chit chat in a coffee room, and then you've got the baseline of more anxiety producing.
Yeah, you basically invited a different person into the interview room.
Exactly. So it's that if we change the context, you will always change the baseline. So there's no point baselining here and using that baseline to assess behavior against that baseline in this context.
And you've hit the nail on the head. So this is a bit that was driving me mental, because the particular phrase this person was using, not to be named, a lot of them do it though, is once I've got that individual's baseline, and it's always singular. So it's always like, I can sit with this person for a particular amount of time, and once I understand his baseline, I can then ask him whatever I want, and then I'll be able to glean valuable information based on that kind of pre-collected baseline. But it's fluid as ever. It constantly changes. It can change just by a question. So even if the environment context doesn't change, just by asking a particular question that is interpreted in a particular way, the baseline will immediately change. There's just far too much weight, I think, put on the word baseline and how much people talk about it within the context of behavioral analysis.
And I think this is something that we try and get very much across with regards to baseline in the work that we do with police, for example. If you're in an interview situation, you're checking some context of a case, for example, and you're talking about less interrogatory questioning lines. You're just trying to establish some facts at the beginning. That will have a very particular baseline. Yes, it's a police interview, whether you're a witness or a suspect or whatever. Yes, it's a police interview. The second there is any question that's perceived as some level of interrogation or an accusation, or they think that the line has changed, their baseline will change. Now, that's not like, their baseline has changed.
But that's what people do, though.
You've changed the context of the questioning, therefore you have to adapt to what is this person's baseline when these kinds of questions are asked. Then we're looking at, okay, within this realm, what can we do? It's not easy. So a lot of people say, well, how do you get baseline? How long do you need to get baseline? Some people have to get baseline if you're working in an airport context, especially undercover, behavior detection officers or something like that. They have to get baseline within 1 minute of chatting with someone undercover, because they can't hang around for an hour having a conversation and doing that. So there's no kind of standard said, if you do this, you'll definitely have good baseline. It's really, have I established a context in the context of this conversation, in this interaction? How is this person behaving? Okay, I'm going to ask this particular question and we'll see what happens. Is there a consistency in their behavior, or is there an inconsistency in the behavior? If there's an inconsistency in the behavior, you then have to do another check. So I'm then going to check, okay, is it actually, there's a change in the behavior, but is it consistent with what they've just said, consistent with the account, or is it consistent with the fact that actually the way I just asked that question is quite aggressive and they changed in their behavior, they became more defensive in their response, but I was a little bit more aggressive, so that actually is consistent, not inconsistent.
Yeah, and this is the thing. We see this a lot of the time with experienced interviewers and interrogators as well, is they'll do the standard, your name, your date of birth, where you live, all that kind of stuff, and then they lean in and they get to the point of the interrogation and what it's about. And then you'll see a lot of commentators who are watching these interviews talk about how uncomfortable that person immediately gets. And, he's uncomfortable now because they know that he's going to dive in and he might get caught for, doing a crime. But anyone gets uncomfortable doing that. Yeah. And this is the problem. They think by putting people under stress will make them uncomfortable, will increase their cognition, therefore make it harder for people to be deceptive. However, increasing stress in an innocent person also inhibits their ability to convey information. Yeah. And it's just this really weird thing, this little cycle of stress.
Exactly, because we know from work done in survival research, for example, that when people are under stress, they find instructions harder to remember. So if you are putting people under stress, you're increasing cortisol in the system, and cortisol will inhibit recall in those cases. And so if you are in those, especially investigative interview situations, if you're dealing with people, you're trying to get information out of them and they're anxious, that's going to cause problems with them being able to recall information.
Yeah.
Equally, it makes it harder for you to assess any kind of behavioral changes because you've already increased their level of discomfort. What we tend to look for in behavior analysis is we want to have people as relaxed as possible so that when there is a question that is harder for them, for example, to answer in an investigative context, and we're talking in an investigative context right now, that we'll see a spike or a change in behavior. But if you're increasing stress, their behavior is already up here. If you think about a polygraph kind of output, the behavior is already up here. So everything that's happening, all of the spikes in behavior are just hidden by huge amounts of anxiety that you've created because of your poor interview process. So there's so much contamination, and our job is to reduce that contamination as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, the way I've always looked at that is it's almost like trying to hear someone play a violin with a loud white noise in the background. It's really hard to hear the notes of the violin poke through.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time people contaminate the environment, whether it's physical environment, with it being a very kind of aggressive interview room, or with the way that they ask questions, that the noise increases and increases and increases, that it does become impossible to see those little spikes.
Yeah.
And it's bonkers that is so often used within police interviewing. When the stakes are super high, they go in with those kind of aggressive tactics, which actually minimizes your effectiveness at spotting the behavior you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely far better now than it used to be, a few years ago, or a couple of decades ago, with things like the peace process and stuff within UK policing in particular, where you've got that element of rapport being an important part. And it's just trying to keep in mind those elements of baseline and of the impact of the context and those kinds of things. Because one of the things we do with students, for example, is get them to think about their own baselines, plural, because right now I'm talking like this, and so when I'm on camera like this, I'm probably more aware of my diction. Now, I'm from Norfolk, so I have a habit of dropping my T's if I say words like battery, for example, rather than battery. But if I'm on camera, I might be more conscious of that and pronounce things differently. Equally, here, I'm speaking in this way, but when I go home and I see my young 9-year-old lad, Addy, and he comes in, I'm not going to go, "Hello, Addison. Today we're going to be having a conversation about this. What have you done?" I don't speak like this when I speak to my 9-year-old son.
Yeah.
So I completely adapt to that context. I become a completely different person. Now, as I've said, I try and be as close to authentic me as I am when I'm doing these kinds of things or training as possible. But we change huge amounts, and it's really interesting. And try this, but think about those 6 channels, and how expressionate are you on the face, for example? I use my face quite a lot, but in a business context and business meetings, are you as expressionate? Are you even more expressionate when you're at the football game or when you're out at a party? How does the context change the way you use a particular channel of communication? How does your vocal information change? When you're on the phone, how does that change how you act and your body language, everything? So if you think about all of the channels and then think about different contexts in your life, personal and professional, and you'll start to notice how different a person you are being perceived by other people within those different contexts. You'll realize that baseline is so fluid and so dynamic and so attached to context that's a useful exercise to do, doing some baselining work on your own life and communication.
So, with it being so fluid then, why the hell is it in every body language book out there, every YouTube channel who talks about body language? Why is baseline always talked about as a thing, an immovable thing?
Yeah, because if we say this is how people normally behave, is a difficult phrase. So it's really important to think, how does this person seem to behave consistently in a context like this when we're doing this kind of thing? How do they typically behave in this context? It's really important to do that so that you can see, okay, now they're doing something different in this topic or on this topic than they did when we talked about this topic. What is it about the topic that changed, that changed the way? Now, is it because you've completely changed the context and you're being more aggressive, therefore that's why it's changed? Or is it something about the person being discussed that's shifted? So it's, when do we notice those shifts in baseline from they've consistently behaved this way until we bring up this point without changing the way we've asked questions, without suddenly becoming more aggressive or more interrogatory or whatever it might be. And now they're doing something different. So it's important to notice it, but it's important to realize that even within one conversation, within one interview, within one chat with your friend in a bar, you're going to see so many different baselines. You'll see baseline of a friend talking about holiday, a baseline of a friend listening to you talk about your problems at work, a baseline of your friend talking about their family, and they will look and behave differently consistently during that period of conversation depending on those interactional contexts. So it's interesting to know, in the context of this that I'm dealing with right now, what is their typical behaviours? What are they doing with their face? How do they sound? How loud are they? Which kind of pitch range have they got? What kind of words are they choosing to use? And when that changes, I'm interested. That's all I am. That's why we call them points of interest rather than signs of lying or anything like that. They're just points of interest. Oh, that's interesting. Their behaviour changed slightly in that channel when that was mentioned. I wonder why that might be. And then we can start to hypothesize and then test those hypotheses.
So do you think it's a mistake to even use the term baseline, given the fact that it constantly changes, even within just one individual?
No, I think you just have to be aware that baselines constantly change. It's an interesting word because we do need to consider how people typically behave within certain contexts, but we have to be aware that that person's baseline is so linked to context, and that you are part of the context, that your behavior can cause shifts in baseline too. So you have to bring yourself into any considerations. So if I'm having a conversation with you, for example, and we're talking about something that's got an emotive quality to it, you've got some problems or something like that, maybe with someone in the office, not that we ever have ones, several people in the office, but we're having an emotive conversation, and I'm watching you and I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'll notice some element of your behavior shift, or I might see a facial expression, or your voice will dip, and I think, okay, there seems to be something that's potentially emotional happening here. I need to make a judgment on whether that's important or not, but it's different. You've not behaved that way up to this point. So your baseline during this conversation has been like this. And when I mentioned this particular thing, there was a drop. Now, that's an indication to me that there has been something that's changed emotionally or psychologically or cognitively for you. And then I have a decision to make on whether I investigate that or not. Now, in that context, if we're having a conversation and you wanted to open up about stuff, then I might choose to come back to that and explore that more and see if there's anything that you wanted to talk about. In an investigative context, you might leave it and think, okay, it could be about this, it could be about the question, it could be they would think about something else when they did that. And then I might want to come back in and talk about that topic, but talk around the topic, not ask the same question, and see if I get a similar kind of shift in responses. So I'm testing behaviours. So it's how do people behave more consistently when there's deviation from how people are behaving in this context, in this way, then I notice it. It's a point of interest. It's something I can put in my pocket. Where we have large shifts, so we talk about things like 3 points of interest within 2 channels or over 2 channels within a few seconds, 7 seconds of behaviour thereabouts. We call that a cluster. If there's a cluster of behaviours done, I'm even more interested about, oh wow, what's going on there? There's a lot of shifted across the channels at this point. I might go in there and have a look, but again, I'm testing to see what's going on there. And if I probe those areas a little bit more, can I get more information out so I can more fully understand what's going on for the individual, emotionally, cognitively, or otherwise. So.
Right. And if you were going to, I guess to wrap this up, if you were going to give some tips to people on how to kind of mitigate the consequences of creating too many baselines across a certain context, let's say it's a job interview.
Yeah.
What kind of things can you put in place, or what kind of behaviors can you do as the interviewer to try and limit the contamination of multiple baselines happening?
Yeah, it's reduction of contamination as much as possible, or mitigate contamination as much as you possibly can, because anxiety is huge. So if in a professional context, for example, if we're talking about job interviews and you're doing some kind of recruitment work, really think about the setting. Don't put people in the corner of a room and you sit behind a table, 2 people, they're pinned at the corner of the room. That can feel oppressive. That's going to cause anxiety, which is going to be difficult. So it's about making sure that you do that kind of, if I'm in this room, and bear in mind you are you, so you're not the other person, so you can't assume that you know exactly how people will feel, but how does this environment feel given the context and the information I'm trying to achieve right now? What kinds of questions, or what's the line of conversation I want to go down, whether it's friend, family, colleague, whatever it might be, and how might that come across? Really kind of plan those things out and make sure that you're trying to be as clear as possible. Certainly with questions, when it comes to baseline, if you're asking multiple questions, that's one thing that can often happen in interviews. So what I'd like to know about is, you mentioned that this and this and this and this, and so I was thinking about this, so what I'd like you to tell me is this. If you're kind of framing with lots of things that make people start to process cognitively, so they think you're going to ask one question, but then you ask another question, so you'll get a whole bundle of responses at that. So you'll see lots of different reactions to their assumption on what's about to be asked. And then even when you do finish the question, they may then start to respond because they're not sure on what part that you want to ask. So being very clear, making sure the environment is conducive to being relaxed, regardless if it's an interrogation or not. But it comes back to emotional intelligence in my mind.
That's an exercise in empathy, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Put yourself into the shoes of that person who you're having a conversation with, and how would you like to be interviewed?
Yeah.
And I think if you can answer that question, you are going to limit all those contaminants.
Definitely. And that brings us back to that emotional intelligence. You were talking about self-awareness and self-management, and bearing in mind that you are a huge part of that interaction. So it's not that when we analyse behaviour out there and we're looking at those people, they are responding to your behaviour. They're responding to your questions. So you are causing their behaviour. So how can you make sure that your behaviour is not contaminating and you cannot not contaminate. So you're always going to contaminate, but how do you mitigate any contamination that might confuse your analysis of the person in front of you?
Nice. Well, thank you very much.
Excellent. It was a good conversation.
It was.
But I would say keep an eye on your own baselines and think about how your own baselines across the channels are different in different areas, and let us know how you change in different contexts. See you next time. Take care.
All the best.